Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. And I'm sorry I couldn't join you there today. I'm spending some time with some family that's in town, and whenever you have the opportunity to do so, it's always a good thing to do. My name is Daniel Godwin, for those of you who don't know me. And if we haven't met before, nice to meet you. I am the Arapahoe Roosevelt Pawnee National Grasslands Wildfire Crisis Strategy Program Manager, detailed into that position, and my day job is a fire management planning specialist for the ARP, as well as the Medicine Bow route. I am able to serve on the operations subcommittee as one of the co-leads there, along with Parker Titus and Max Erickson. And I'm excited to talk today about weaving the spatial strategy into collaborative engagement. So let's start this from first principles. Let's talk about basic facts about the fire shed here. First, we know that big fires roll over small treatments. The small stuff is not effective when we're getting big runs. And so this is a shot here of Cameron Peak on one of their big run days, and you can see, a smaller 10, 20, 100 acre treatment is not necessarily going to do the work that we need to under those conditions. We also know that fires generally move from west to east here on the Front Range, which is very convenient, and that we can use that to help plan the work that we're doing. And we also know that fuels treatments are more effective in these middle elevations. We know from monitoring that our ability to effectively treat at higher elevations in the lodgepole, as you see there on the left of the screen, the bigger fire, is less effective. And in that dry mixed conifer in the Ponderosa, it can be very effective. We also know we have limited time and resources to do big things, to do a lot of work before the next big fire or fires, right? It's getting hotter, drier, windier, and our ability to prepare is constrained by that. We also know that we have a lot of funding now, but the funding itself is always a finite resource. So with this information, so what? What are we going to do with this? What we need is an approach to planning fuel treatments that address these facts. We need to work on this quickly. We need to move forward with all deliberate speed. I feel a great moral imperative to do this work, to protect the forests and watersheds so that they can stay forest and watersheds for the future, to protect communities, and also just to protect wildflower habitat, because I like wildflowers. So let me nerd out here for a minute. And for those that know me, this is not uncommon, along with dad jokes. When we think about fuels treatment, it's a collective action problem. And so if you're familiar with things like the prisoner's dilemma or any other kind of processes like that, you may be familiar with this. But we all have stakeholder-focused priorities. We want to treat our specific areas. If we all pursue these separately, the treatments will achieve those local objectives. We may be able to protect around those specific things. However, if we all pursue our individually maximizing pursuits here, they won't necessarily add up to landscape scale treatments, which is what we need to do to succeed. So if we all pursue our own individual goals, we won't necessarily achieve an outcome that is optimal here. We have to collaborate and align our treatments. Otherwise, our individual small treatments will fail when a next big fire comes through. So to misquote a misquote of Benjamin Franklin, we either burn together or we shall all surely burn separately. We need to work together on this, and honestly, that is the goal and the special sauce that is the fire shed, right? So let's take it to the next step here. How do we look at where we should be doing these treatments to be effective and to answer all of those truisms we've started this conversation with? And to me, I think the real outcome here, or the real method, is pods. So potential operational delineations. So pods can answer the question of how do we delineate areas within the landscape within which we can manage fire, or to hold fire within, or to fight fire within. So it's identifying the right road, the right ridge, all that kind of stuff. But pods aren't just a Forest Service or federal construct. They're useful for everyone, because when we're drawing pod boundaries, and we'll talk about that in just a second here, the pod boundaries are based on features on the landscape, not jurisdictions. And fire, as we always say, and if you're going to have a game where you take a sip of your beverage every time someone says something, or you have a bingo card, you can add this to it as fire doesn't recognize jurisdictions, and that's true. But also our planning for it needs to move beyond jurisdictions, and pods are a mechanism for that. So let's talk about pods a little bit. How do we do it? Some of us know a lot about pods, and some of us know pods only as pod people. So pods are driven by a combination of best available science, data science, and expert knowledge. And I think that's the real great thing about pods, is that you derive these potential control locations using fancy machine learning work, and that includes topography, fuels, fire footprints, all kinds of things like that. But then you bring that around a table with a bunch of experts, a bunch of fire practitioners in that area, and say, okay, based on this, where should we connect the dots? Where do we want to create risk containers for fire? And so you then come out of that with potential operational delineations pods. So here's a nice illustration recently worked on for the fire shed in the Forest Service here, and it kind of shows what pods can look like. And I like the illustration style here because it somewhat reminds me of the little sketches that you see in the older Lord of the Rings books, right, with the little mountains there. But you can see these yellow blobs within these. They're drawn within ridge lines or along previously burned areas or water features. And within those, that's the pod. So you can think about the pod boundary around them, and different pod boundaries have different levels of effectiveness, right? Like a rocky mountain range or scree, that might be a pretty effective edge. Or a large water body, whereas just a small 2-track road, maybe it's a decent boundary, but you're going to have to do some work with it, right? And so that's where you end up with these pods moving across the landscape, right? So then let's bring this to our strategy here, and what we're proposing is a pod-driven strategy that creates opportunity for us to do more work with increasing precision. So our first step here is we want to strengthen pod boundaries where we need to. And if you're strengthening pod boundaries, that gives you a lot more opportunity to work within them, right? Maybe you can burn off of those pod boundaries where you need to during a wildfire, or maybe you can burn within them as a prescribed fire. But first, those 2 tracks that are critically important, or those smaller roads, that needs to be improved. And so that's our first step. That part's time consuming and expensive, so we want to put our effort there. But that buys us time and opportunity to burn within these pods. And so once we've started burning contiguous pods together, that suddenly gives us a lot of space, right? So when you have those big fire run days, maybe it's going to hit those burn units, and those now are going to knock it down, just like we saw happen on Cameron Peak. It's going to drop down to something that's manageable. And so if we've done those 2 things, we start moving at the top of this pod pyramid here. And I know I'm mixing metaphors, and that's another thing that I do often. But once we've done those, it buys us time to really focus on the smaller things that are out there that aren't necessarily less important, but if we just focused on those, we would fail collectively, right? So maybe that's the smaller watershed protection projects, or the community protection projects, or things identified in CWPPs. It's not that those things aren't important. It's just that if we focus all of our effort on those right now, I don't want to miss the forest for the trees, but we will be ineffective in managing larger fires. Whereas if we're focusing on these pod boundaries and linked defensible space, or linked operational space with pods, then we can actually buy ourselves some time to do that work, and we'll be successful. And I think it's always, I want to hit on this point that no single pod will necessarily be the thing that does the work for you on a big fire day, right? So you need depth, because it may blow straight through one on a high wind event, because we've all seen high wind events here in the Front Range, but maybe you're now ready at the next pod boundary to either burn that out or pick it up once it drops down when the wind falls out that night, right? So you can't just have a single pod. You need defense in depth. You need multiple pods layered around them. So they need to be contiguous and layered together. So then let's think about that middle elevation again, that Goldilocks zone. The lower elevations in the grassland, that stuff grows back very quickly, and there's a lot of WUI there. So working in those treatments, it has utility, but it's not going to be effective in stopping the big fire run days. It's not going to give you that space to do the work. Up in the lodgepole, you got to spend a lot of money for minimal impact, right? That stuff's going to burn. But in this Goldilocks boundary in between it, that dry mixed conifer, that ponderosa, that's where we can actually get some work done. So if we start aligning pods along that boundary north to south, that starts to look something like a ribbon, right? And you may have heard about the ribbon. We've been talking about the ribbon in different ways for a while. But really the ribbon is just aligning and coordinating efforts in contiguous pod treatments north to south within this middle elevation. And, I'm prone to making the joke that the real ribbon is the friends that we made along the way, but that's because, aligning our efforts around pods, aligning our efforts around the ribbon here, that's going to need a lot of collaboration, and that's what the fire shed is all about. It's about working together to achieve positive outcomes, to increase the pace and scale of beneficial fire on the landscape, right? And so this is how we can do that, right? Which is exciting. So just to visualize this here back on our illustration, we can look at buffing out these pod boundaries, and so that's the red there. And so maybe those are the ones that we've identified as being critically important to get the work done. And then you can see there along the, there's some previously burned area, and you can see those hashed in trees there. And so we can anchor into that with additional fire. And so once we've done that work, once we've buffed out those pod boundaries, suddenly we have some pretty big burn blocks to work with then, right? And so once we start burning along those burn blocks, we have a ribbon, and you can see, you've got pods in depth in this middle elevation area that opens up opportunity space for us to protect communities, watersheds, and forests. So how are we going to do this? I told you there might be some dad jokes. We're going to collaborate to clobber climate change conflagrations, because pod people can plan Pyrrhic prevention processes. And I just got really excited to write that, so I wanted to keep that slide in. So next steps, how are we going to do this? Well, our first step is we got to know who should come together to work on this. And so today we're going to be working on defining these sub-landscapes. And so that's going to be the folks that will come together and meet to start identifying where we're going to put these pod treatments, right? And what pod boundaries are important. Because, we have this phrase that all politics is local, but to me, all fire is local. And fire is about people and their relationship to the land. And so it's important, I believe, to bring local collaboratives and partners and communities together so that we can bring in both the values that those communities hold dear and the science and the firefighting and the fire prevention and the prescribed fire all together into this big happy process. And so the first step is figuring out who needs to be at the table and what the shape of that table is, again, to mix my metaphors. So then what are we going to do? We're going to stitch a ribbon from pods. So we're going to break that collective action problem. So we'll work together and we're going to identify the pod boundaries along this. And we're going to identify which pod boundaries need work and how we can do that work. And then within that, we can focus on the pods across these sub-landscapes and try and identify the ones that offer the most community protection and continuity and interior burning potential. Because really this process here is the important one, right? This is as much values-based as it is science-based. And you can bring all kinds of different models to the table to try and identify priorities. And that's great. That can help inform your decision making. But if fire is ultimately about people, then that's who's got to be making the decision. I mean, there's a classic poster that was up in IBM, and they had it said something to the effect that computers can never make a decision, only people can make a decision, right? And I think that's very important. And the way we make good decisions is we bring the best available science, but then we also bring our heart and our values to it. So that's how we're going to do this. We're going to define the pod boundaries together. And so what's next? We're going to use this to focus our funding and partnerships within the ribbon. So we're proposing that the investment committee use the BIL money to focus on treatments that support the ribbon. We also need to identify what we need to do to support this on private land too, right? And what other barriers are out there. And so that's going to be this feedback loop of working with the ops subcommittee and these sub-landscape working groups to continuously improve and identify the problems and address those collaboratively. Because this is, this is going to drive where a lot of Forest Service work is going to happen, this process, but it's also going to drive where work on private land is going to get done, or hopefully will get done. And that is messy in different ways than working on federal land is. And so we want to come together and identify where those challenges are and figure them out together and find solutions. And we can't do that without first identifying a plan and continuing to communicate and collaborate around it. And so that's kind of the who, the what, and the how of this, right? And so we will take this and move this forward and hopefully save the world, or at least, the watersheds and forests that we all care about here. So just to talk about timeline, we're going to define these landscape working group boundaries, the sub-landscapes today, right after this. And I won't be there for it, but I'm excited for y'all. I love drawing on a map. And then we're going to take that and those groups that are identified within those landscapes, they're going to identify priority pod boundaries and priority pods to build out this ribbon over the next couple of months here. And so that work is going to drive additional planning that's going to go on in the forest. We're going to work up some new EAs, and that's going to be based on the work that we're going to be doing here, which is pretty exciting to me, as exciting as forest level planning gets. And then I think the other side of this is that we'll continue to this can also drive and should drive the work on private land, and that's an ongoing process. And then we're just going to continue also, I say we will continue, and this is important, to meet at these landscape level, sub-landscape level, collaborative meetings to plan out the work, identify challenges, and adapt and overcome. And this is not the only work that will go on forward, because we'll find there will be other pots of money that can focus on non-ribbon efforts. But I truly believe that this effort is our best chance to move forward, to buy us space and time to really focus on a lot of the other stuff that's out there, from community protection to smaller watershed projects, all of this. And that work is critically important, and I want to see it succeed. And the only way that it'll succeed is if we've done this hard work, this expensive work, this truly landscape level work to manage fire and to buy ourselves space to do this work. So that's exciting. I'm excited to hear the conversation and the questions that will come out of this, but I won't be here to answer those questions. So please ask the folks in the room. If you have any tomatoes to throw, aim them at the screen. You can aim them at my little face here on the bottom, and don't throw them at the people in the room. They're very nice. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.